Hello. Welcome to North Country History. I'm Rob Berg, and I will be your guide this week on the forest history of the Great Lakes region. Today, we're going to kind of go off onto a new subject, one that we haven't really dealt with yet here on the podcast, and that is climate change. Yep, I'm going there. I know it's controversial to some. I don't understand why, because it is something that has been happening here in our region, not just in the recent history, but for centuries. Our climate changes. Sometimes it goes one way, sometimes it goes another way, and sometimes it changes because of what we have done to the environment. And so today we're going to look at how the logging and wildfires here in the Great Lakes region in the 19th century affected climate change. So we're going to talk about that today. So sit back, settle in, and enjoy the show. North Country History with Rob Berg, your podcast on the forest history of the Great Lakes region. Michigan and all of the Great Lakes region was the center of the white pine lumber industry during the last half of the 19th century and well into the first 2 decades of the 20th century. This industry, which began in the 17th century along the Atlantic coast of northeastern North America and spread across the northeastern United States and eastern Canada, over the course of the next 2 centuries would bring economic wealth while building and expanding the European settlements in the New World. The lumber industry in the Great Lakes region was an economic boom that created wealth and encouraged settlement and the development of communities, but left in the former timberlands a wasteland. Without the moderating forest canopy, the cutover lands were susceptible to extreme weather conditions, warm and dry soils, cooler temperatures, stronger storms, greater runoff, and wind that eroded the landscape and affecting the surrounding freshwater basins. The enormous amount of slash became a prime cache of fuel for wildfires. The conflagrations in Michigan, Minnesota, and Wisconsin during the 1870s to the 1920s contributed to this changing environment. In 2023, I presented a paper at the Association for Living History, Farm, and Agricultural Museums Conference at Sauter Village, Ohio. This organization, better known as ALFAM, has I've been a member of since the early 2000s and have presented papers there a few times at different conferences. And this time I wanted to connect something I had been, working on for, a number of years, a couple of decades, the lumber industry, along with, issues that has been happening here in our modern time that we've been looking at for really at least the last 50 years, and that has been climate change. And all you have to do is follow the news and see the wildfires that have happened in the western United States and western Canada over the last several years, and can see how terrible these fires have been and how they have really impacted life. And some of these are happening naturally, lightning strikes. They can, comes from annual dry winds, the Santa Ana winds in California. But many of them have happened in places where logging has taken place. And whenever you cut trees down, it gets warmer and drier in that area, at least on a temporary basis. You can really, overlooking at time though, the areas where the logging has taken place, the actual soil temperatures and the ground temperatures are cooler, but with the carbon that really is released in the air from after the trees have been cut that hold in carbon dioxide, that will cause, more warming overall. But the slash that is left, the dry branches, the trees that are not harvested, all of that becomes severe fire hazards. And that is always very susceptible to fire. Again, a lot of them are natural lightning strikes, But during the 19th century, when railroads came through, you would have the fires coming from that, from where the cinders from the smokestacks can catch sparks, can catch fires. You also have sparks coming from the metal wheels on the metal rails that are not well lubricated. So you will then have sparks that can catch dry tinder, dead vegetation along the way there, and that can cause fires to begin that way. And then there's those that are man-made, burning that slash, clearing the land for farming, errant fire, campfires getting away from each other, or just outright arson. And these fires, they burn hot, they burn fast. And next thing you know, you have devastated areas. But we're not just here talking about the fire, but it's kind of the overall of logging, the fires, the slash that is left there, the attempts to clean it up, the attempting to farm areas where the soil nutrients are poor. All of that led to at least localized climate change that, for the most part, in the upper Great Lakes region, recovered, largely due to the effect of reforestation that began at the beginning of the 20th century and really sped along with the 1930s with the Civilian Conservation Corps, who we recently spoke about with guests Phil Nod and Bill Jamerson. So these, were areas where it was able to return. What we're seeing now is, has it gone too far? Can we return? Can we turn things around? I can't answer that, and this episode is not going to try to answer that, but more so just to kind of putting everything into a historical perspective of what happened in the past, trying to use some of that evidence to look at what's happening now. I'm not a scientist. I'm an environmental historian, but not an environmental scientist. I did look at a number of journal articles at the time when I wrote my paper 2 years ago of the research on boreal forests. The Great Lakes forests are not boreal forests. We're a little bit south of that, but of modern studies, those are the closest to what I could find to the Great Lakes region. So the boreal forests, you can think of the forests in Canada, north of the Great Lakes, along what's called the Canadian Shield, going north up to the tundra region and spreading across over to Alaska. And then in Eurasia, the forests in Siberia, and going up into Scandinavia. That's the boreal forest that we look at, that scientists have looked at, and to try to draw some conclusions on. And that's where I've kind of looked at as comparison. Although, again, I'm not a scientist, I'm a historian, so I try to put it into the historical perspective. I have spoken much about logging on the podcast already, so I don't really want to get back into it too much in this episode. But I just want to go over just a few brief items from my paper, and just to kind of reiterate what we've talked about before. Lumbermen preferred a specific species of tree. The eastern white pine was the most popular tree for the lumbermen to cut. It is a relatively light wood, especially compared to hardwoods like oak and maple. It grows straight, tall, sometimes reaching upwards of 220 feet, though most of the large trees were in the 150 to 170 feet tall range. It has a large trunk, commonly 4 to 6 feet wide diameter, and as a self-pruning species, it has very few knots in the clear pine. It is also a long-living tree, with mature old-growth trees living to 300 to 500 years. This gives tight and strong growth rings. The white pine has a large range, being found from the Atlantic coast of the northeastern North America, in the modern maritime provinces of Canada, and in New England in the United States to the Great Lakes and west into eastern Manitoba and Minnesota, where the prairies become the major landscape. Prior to the development of the railroads in the 19th century, water was the best way to transport heavy cargo over long distances. This included pine logs. Besides being lightweight, white pine is very buoyant. Logging near rivers was ideal, floating the logs down the river to waiting sawmills at the mouths of rivers or at the break in transportation. To get the logs to the rivers, the heavy logs were best cut in the winter so they could be dragged by oxen and later draft horses, either by skidding or on sleighs on ice roads to the riverbank. In the spring, the logs were then sent on the spring floodwaters to the mills. This would remain logging's modus operandi until the greater demand changed everything in the 19th century. Logging in the Great Lakes. Michigan, and soon after Wisconsin and Minnesota, would become the center of the white pine industry beginning in the 1840s. It would continue to be the major industry in Michigan to 1910, and even hanging on to in the 1920s in some locations. In neighboring states, the pine industry extended to the 20s and even to the Great Depression. It has been said, though likely it is just a myth invented by later writers, that Michigan's white pine would last 500 years. We do know that the amount of pine in Michigan did surpass other logging regions in the United States. And realizing that the demand for lumber in 1840 and the technology available for harvesting and transportation meant that logging was done selectively in the first 3 decades of the industry here, instead of the clear cutting that began in the 1870s, it was truly believed to be an inexhaustible resource. Rivers and lakes were the primary choice of transportation, but demand was increasing. With the popularity of railroads skyrocketing, there were experimentations in the use of rail transportation of the logs. Early attempts in Michigan included Blendon's Landing on the Grand River in the 1850s, and the Glencoe, Pinconning, and Lakeshore Railroad near Saginaw Bay in the early 1870s. The former, using a log tramway, did not survive due to the Civil War, and the latter, though quite promising, was finished by the economic depression in 1873. It was not until 1876 that Clare County lumberman Winfield Scott Garrish would be successful with his Lake George and Muskegon River Railroad. Although Garrish and others were using the railroad to extend their distance from the rivers, horse-drawn sleighs were at about a 6-mile limit from the rivers. The growth of main rail lines through northern Michigan would soon allow the transportation of logs directly by rail to the mills. And conversely, locating the sawmills right on the rail line and shipping the finished lumber by rail directly to the consumer. This expanded the area of lumber operations to almost every corner of the pinery. The railroad opened up a greater range of logging available to the lumbermen's axes and saws, but it was a much more expensive way to move logs. A river was a set location that one could cut. However, there were ways of deepening and straightening channels, building dams and sluices, and removing obstacles that could extend the length of a river's navigational length. All of that cost money over the basic expense of hiring a driving crew. But with the railroad, one needed to survey and build the rail line, which needed additional labor and equipment, purchase the steel for the track, purchase or lease the locomotives, tenders, and cars, plus equipment for loading the logs onto the cars. A few lumbermen, such as Winfield Scott Garrish and David Ward, built and owned their own logging railroads, but many, including the Salling Hanson and Company of Grayling, leased the tracks and equipment from existing railroad companies. Logging railroads were an enormous expense. To pay for it, a lumberman had to seek optimal profitability from its operation. No longer was logging just a seasonal operation, but the railroad allowed for year-round logging. To pay for this new technology, more of the trees needed to be cut. Prior to the use of the railroads, typically a stand of pine was cut selectively, with only the largest trees harvested. A logging company might reserve the rest of the tract for later cuts. However, with the introduction of the railroad and greater demands for lumber, clear cutting became the new trend. Not only the large white pine and red pine were being logged, but any tall, straight pine was cut, even trees of 8 to 10 inches in diameter. Pines were not the only trees cut either. Prior to the railroad, they were greatly favored as the natural buoyancy of the logs allowed them to float well on the rivers. Mixed in with the pine were a number of other species of value, such as cedar, hemlock, oak, maple, and beech. Cedar, though not growing very large, was valued for fence posts and railroad ties. Hemlock had a large tannic acid content that was needed for the leather tanning industry, and the oak, maple, and beech hardwoods were good for furniture building, floors, and wood paneling for home construction. Few of these could easily be moved by water, but now they could be transported by rail. The final reason for clear cutting was demand for more lumber. Prior to the Civil War, most of Michigan's lumber was either staying in Michigan for domestic use or going east to Albany and points along the Atlantic seaboard. Even with the growth of Chicago from 1837 onward and the construction of the Illinois and Michigan Canal, not nearly as much lumber was heading west. That would change with the construction of the Transcontinental Railroad. The Transcontinental Railroad began in 1866 and was completed in 1869. The Union Pacific Railroad was responsible for the eastern construction beginning at Omaha, while the Central Pacific Railroad built the line through the Sierra Nevada mountains and the deserts of Nevada and Utah. The UPRR line ran from the Great Plains and the territories, later states of Nebraska and Wyoming, where there was very little local lumber available. Native cottonwoods along the Platte River were available for temporary track building, but for trestles, bridges, telegraph poles, and other needs, the lumber would have to be imported from the Great Lakes region. The construction of the Transcontinental Railroad and the establishment and growth of towns along the railroad led in part to Nebraska's statehood in 1867. Migration to the west along this rail line would speed the development of the Great Plains and the Rocky Mountains regions through the rest of the 19th century. A ready supply of lumber from the Great Lakes region was a necessity for this growth. All of this led to a much quicker period of harvesting. As early as the 1880s, there were some men, including botanist and agricultural professor William Beall of Michigan Agriculture College, now Michigan State University, and I've talked about him in an earlier episode, who believed that the cutover lands would become environmental wastelands. Although the idea of conservation and reforestation of these cutover lands would take 2 decades to take root, the seeds had been planted. The opposition to reforestation would remain strong for a number of decades, though. The greatest opposition to this was due to the belief that the cutover lands would become prime agricultural lands. It was not yet realized that the majority of the timberlands were not ideal for farming. Those who farmed the land learned that, except for the drained swamplands of the Saginaw Valley and the Thumb, which contained rich black soil, that the only thriving crop to grow in the sandy soils of northern Michigan besides pine forests was potatoes. When the overabundant potato market crashed, farmers went bankrupt. The aftermath in the cutover lands. What was not recognized at the time was the long-term environmental effects of logging. There were several detrimental results from this lucrative industry. At the time, land with the trees removed was considered improved agricultural land, and improved in quotations, as it was ready for the plow, without the needs to remove those unwanted trees. Many farmers cleared the slash from their land by burning it. Once a tract of timberland was logged over, the land was not needed by the lumbermen anymore. Some land had been leased by the lumber companies from private owners, while others had been purchased outright. The owners had 3 options: develop the land for other uses, sell the land, or abandon it. A 4th option was available but was not acted upon until much later: replanting the forest. The first 3 options were the only ones used by the majority of landowners. Land development companies, such as the Michigan Home Colony Company that was created in northeastern Michigan, attempted to sell the cutover timberland. This was done under the belief that the cutover land was, again, in quotations, improved agricultural land, and all the new landowners needed to do was to turn the soil and plant their crops. These companies created brag books and advertisements in newspapers to entice new populations to the cutover lands. Presque County, in the northeast corner of the Lower Peninsula, saw large immigrant populations from Germany and Poland settle on these lands. Some of these farmers were successful, but the majority failed. Some of these companies even advertised to new immigrant communities in their native language, like the Wisconsin Central Railroad's Land Development Department that advertised in Germany. The second option was the sale of the land to other companies or individuals for continued use. Typically, not all of the land in a tract was cut. Many companies only filled specific orders from a tract of timberland. There would remain trees that did not fit the orders, maybe wrong species of trees, trees of the wrong size or quality, or the tract was just not large enough to economically cut. The Hanson Pines tract was such a stand. At 86 acres, surviving due to the Panic of 1893, it was not large enough to make a profit for the Salling Hansen and Company. It would find its real wealth as a tourist destination in the creation of Hartwick Pines State Park in 1929. This was an exception, though. Most of these lands would be sold or leased to smaller operators who might clean out a stand for specialty orders, or for pulp or cordwood. Even the Salling Hansen and Company contracted out to small jobbers like James Nibbs Sr. to handle jobs too small for a large operation to bother with. Nibbs worked a tract in what would become Hartwick Pines 13 years later. Another popular harvest was of the stumps, especially the fire-scarred ones for the production of potash and turpentine. The chemical industry would arrive in many communities during the post-lumber period. Midland, at the confluence of the Chippewa and Tittabawassee River in Michigan, would become the home of the H. Dow Chemical Company. Grayling, the home of the Salling Hansen and Company and its successors, would be the site of a DuPont plant. The third and increasingly popular option was to abandon the land outright. Many of the lumber companies, after cutting an area, would decide that continued ownership of the land was not feasible. They simply stopped paying the property tax on the land, and it would revert back to the government, either the local municipality or the state. Some of this land might be sold in tax sales and auctions to others, but much of this was land that would be used for the creation of state and national forests. These new forests, created as reserves for future timber harvests, were not popular in many regions. When the state of Michigan established the Higgins Lake Nursery and the Higgins Lake and Houghton Lake State Forest Reserves in 1903, the citizens and county government of Roscommon County protested this move, believing that the state was taking over available agricultural land. This despite the fact that the site of the Higgins Lake Nursery had been established on the site of a failed potato farm. The nursery would operate from 1904 to 1965 and would provide employment for hundreds of local people and be a major work site of the Civilian Conservation Corps from 1933 to 42. When the nursery closed, the site was converted to North Higgins Lake State Park, which has preserved the historic landscape of the former tree nursery and a large amount of public access along the shore of this popular inland lake. In time, the nursery and the state forest became very important and popular with the residents of northern Michigan. Not only was the local population employed, but people were also paid to collect pine cones to provide the seed stock for the nursery. Long before the cutover lands were reforested, they were left littered with slash, the leftover cuttings that were not harvested by the loggers. This included the tops of trees, branches that were trimmed from the trunks, and any trees that had to be cut to make room for the larger trees to come down safely. This slash was left on the ground where it lay. With most of the tree cover gone, the hot summer sun dried the dead brush and limbs, turning it into fuel for future wildfires. For the new farmers, this slash presented an obstacle to farming. It had to be cleared from the fields and disposed of. The easiest way to do this was to burn it. The first task of the new farmer in readying his fields for planting was to clear the fields of the slash. Usually it was gathered in piles in the field and burned. Most of the burn piles were contained, but the longer the slash had been left in the field, the drier it became and more susceptible to getting out of hand, creating a wildfire. It was not uncommon for several farmers in the same vicinity to be burning slash at the same time. On the new open cutover areas where there were few windbreaks, winds could easily allow these fires to get out of hand and turn into uncontrollable fires. Before 1913, fires were so common that they tended to be ignored unless they threatened villages or cities. If they were only burning in the empty cutover lands, the common practice was to let them burn themselves out. On the other hand, if they threatened property or human lives, they were attempts to slow or stop the fire from burning out of control. A major cause of fires in the cutover lands was the railroad. The railroad was a leading cause of wildfires in the cutover lands. The steel wheels of railroad cars traveling over the steel rails can cause sparks to fly, especially if the rails or cars are poorly maintained. Steam locomotives burning wood or coal have sparks or small cinders, leaving the locomotive smokestack along with the smoke from burning fuel. The sparks hitting dry vegetation and slash can set off many small fires along the rail line. If they are not extinguished quickly, they may grow into fires that will get out of hand. A third way of many of the fires in the cutover lands were started was by nature itself. Lightning strikes during thunderstorms are a common occurrence in the forest lands. The dried slash was the perfect fuel for the lightning to begin a wildfire. Fires were a common presence during the lumber period. As mentioned above, they were usually ignored until they began to threaten populated areas or property. However, there were numerous fires that stand out because of their size or the toll that was taken, mainly in lives lost. The first major fire to be documented in Michigan was the Great Fires of 1871. These fires, occurring in October, burned more than 2 million acres across the lower peninsula and parts of the upper peninsula, destroyed or severely damaged more than 40 communities, including the cities of Holland, Manistee, and Port Huron, and left thousands of people homeless. As severe as this fire was, it was overshadowed by 2 other fires that occurred at the same time. 1871 had been a severely hot and dry year, especially during the summer months. The cutover lands were not the only areas that were in danger from flames. Cities were as well. Circumstances came to a head on October 8, 1871 in Chicago, Illinois, and Peshtigo, Wisconsin, and on the following day in Michigan. Peshtigo was a major lumber town in northeastern Wisconsin, not far from Michigan's Upper Peninsula. Chicago was the fastest-growing city in the country and the economic center of the Midwest. It also contained countless lumber yards along the Chicago River, where lumber was staged for transportation to the west. In Peshtigo, like in Michigan, it was an area where there were numerous small fires burning already. On Sunday, October 8th, it was reported that these fires had formed into a large fire that was threatening the town of Peshtigo. In less than an hour, the town was destroyed, and approximately 800 people lost their lives. The fire did not stop with the loss of Peshtigo, but would burn into 11 counties north of the city of Green Bay, and winds would send sparks across Green Bay to the Door Peninsula as well. Fire also crossed the Menominee River, the border between Wisconsin and Michigan, and spread fire into Menominee County, Michigan. 16 communities were destroyed by fire in the 2 states, with an estimate of 1,200 lives lost from the fire. Peshtigo was one of the worst singular fires in American history, especially in the number of lives lost. But it has been mostly overlooked because simultaneously the city of Chicago was experiencing their own conflagration. Contrary to popular myth, Mrs. O'Leary's cow was not the arsonist that history makes her out to be. Instead of kicking over a lantern causing the dry hay or straw to ignite, it was more than likely that a blowing spark caught the dry straw on fire on the evening of October 8th. Like the rest of the Midwest, Chicago was experiencing drought and very hot and dry conditions during the summer and fall of 1871. As a booming city, much of Chicago had been built of lumber, which was cheap and easily available. Once the fire was established, it consumed buildings, especially those built using the popular balloon framing, very quickly. As the fire spread, it built up greater strength and speed. By the evening of October 9th, the fire had burned 4 miles in length and 3/4 of a mile wide, destroying 17,500 buildings and $222 million in property. 90,000 people were left homeless out of a population of 324,000, and upwards of 300 people were killed. Most of the lumber yards along the Chicago River were spared, so there was lumber immediately available for temporary construction. However, Chicago would look to brick and other more fireproof construction for long-term building practices. 1871 would be the first major year for fires in the Great Lakes region, but it would certainly not be the last. Fire in the 3 states occurred almost annually. Major fires included Michigan's Thumb Fire in 1881, the Hinckley, Minnesota Fire in 1894, the 1908 Metz Fire, and the 1911 Au Sable Oscoda fires. Other fires included the Upper Peninsula Fire in 1896 and the Cloquet Fire in Wisconsin in 1918. Following the 1871 fires, Michigan's Thumb would see another major fire in 1881. Much of the land burned in this fire had witnessed the flames of only 10 years prior. The fire was so severe that Clara Barton's American Red Cross organization conducted its first relief operation to aid the survivors of the fire. Like other bad fires, 1908 was a year of hot and dry weather conditions. In Michigan's northern lower peninsula, there had been sporadic fires throughout the summer. The fall continued to follow the same pattern. While history mostly remembers a terrible inferno in Presque County with the destruction of Metz and the death of 27 people, most in a train that was attempting to flee the flames, fire was widespread, including Crawford County, where a fire threatened Hanson Pines, the surviving old-growth tract that would become Hartwick Pines, and in the area of DeWard on the Manistee River, where Antrim, Crawford, Kalkaska, and Otsego counties met. These and other fires helped to push the Great Lakes forest to the brink of extinction. Fire by itself can actually be beneficial to the health of forests, but because of the size and frequency of these fires, instead of burning off the undergrowth to allow new tree regeneration, the fires consumed almost everything in their path. The environmental damage from logging had a huge impact on what was happening here. There was a great environmental impact from logging on the landscapes and natural resources of the upper Great Lakes. There was a huge impact on the previously forested lands and the adjacent waters from fire, erosion, and runoff. Wildlife was also greatly impacted by the lumber industry. The cutover lands were altered permanently, from large mature forests, many being old-growth forests of 200 to 600 years old, to treeless plains, or lands supporting only small tree species and brushy plants. Millions of acres of forest were lost. This contributed to drier and warmer climate conditions. Forests are great for holding in moisture and moderating temperatures. Trees not only use moisture from rainfall, snowmelt, and dew for themselves, but when they have an excess amount of water, the trees will use transpiration to release water vapor into the air from their leaves. This elevates the local humidity, which aids in keeping the fire hazard down. The mature forest also provided much-needed shade for other plant and wildlife. The fires that burned through after logging, utilizing the abundance of slash and other fuel, burned hotter and stronger than previous fires that would burn frequently along the forest floor. These stronger fires at extreme temperatures not only consumed still-standing trees by racing up the trunks into the crowns, but also superheated the topsoil, baking the minerals out of the soil. This left the soil unable to support all but the most minimal of life. More than a century later, some of the cutover lands supported very little tree cover, having the burned stumps as the main feature of the land, and reindeer lichen as the most common plant life, vegetation that is most common on the tundra of the Arctic Circle. Not only through the burning of the nutrients, but also of the lack of shade cover affected the regrowth of the forest. For succession pine forests, there is a need, especially for the white pine, to have a series of pioneer species to first recover an area and allow for shade to temperate the extreme heat and cold to protect the young seedlings and immature trees. In a clear-cut and burned-over land, there is nothing to allow the seedlings to succeed. Pioneer species of aspen, birch, and pin and chokecherries are usually the first trees to come back after a disturbance in the forest. They're nicknamed the ABC trees. Under normal conditions of a storm or small fire, this will happen almost immediately. However, under catastrophic circumstances, it can take decades, even a century, for these species to reestablish themselves. The ABC trees generally have a lifespan of 60 to 70 years. During this time frame, the pines have an opportunity to come back as well. Young pine seedlings are very fragile, susceptible to the hot, dry summer sun and to late and early frosts and freezes. The tree cover of a copse of aspen or birch and individual choke and pin cherries will protect these young trees until they can more establish themselves. The local red pine, also called Norway pine, is more hardier and can withstand the extreme temperatures, so would become the predominant species for reforestation. In normal forest succession, the pine would be ready to take over at the time period that the ABC species were in their decline. But again, this disruption of the normal succession put everything out of whack. Speculation about the climatic effects of deforestation first appeared in the late 1700s and early 1800s. The study of deforestation effects on climate change has been ongoing since the late 20th century, centering mostly on the concerns of the rapid deforestation of the equatorial rainforest. However, the loss of the northern boreal forest has also been a great concern. These studies, mostly concerning deforestation in Canada and of the Russian taiga, directly relates to the Great Lakes lumber industry as the region shares a common forest type. The northern boreal forests consist of evergreen needle-leaf trees such as pines, spruces, hemlocks, and firs, deciduous needle-leaf, larch or tamarack, and deciduous broadleaf trees, mostly maple, oak, beech, elm, ash, aspen, and black walnut. The logging of the forests release large amounts of carbon dioxide and methane into the atmosphere, contributing to greenhouse gases. The canopy layers of the northern boreal forest also moderates the temperature, snowmelt, and retention of moisture in the soil. The removal of trees through logging and subsequent wildfires releases the stored carbon back into the atmosphere. Also, the loss of the forest canopy prevents the conversion of CO2 to oxygen. With the loss of the forest, flooding becomes a greater risk, and the growth of wetlands increases the decomposition of vegetation, creating more methane to be released into the atmosphere. The sources on these will all be listed in the episode notes that you can read. The forest canopy does an incredible job of moderating temperatures and moisture. Without the forest canopy, temperatures decrease, which impairs the regeneration of the forest. Cutover lands in the Great Lakes region took on the characteristics of the Arctic tundra in many ways, as the native vegetation found it difficult to naturally regenerate. The air and soil temperature was too cold to allow for the natural growth of the pine and hardwood forest, even those forest types that were aided by fire. The vegetation that did grow included Cladonia rangiferina, which is reindeer lichen, a cold hardy plant that is found in alpine and Arctic tundra. It spread south due to the localized decrease in temperature after the deforestation of the region. The dryness of the soil and the air was also a direct result of deforestation. Trees not only store carbon and create oxygen, but also releases moisture into the atmosphere. This moisture in the form of rain or snow then returns to earth and contributes to the water levels of the lakes and rivers, and also to the underground water table. In a forest-covered area, the snow cover lasts longer, which allows the snow to melt slower and directly into the soil, as opposed to evaporating directly into the atmosphere. With rain, the runoff slows due to the forest capturing needed moisture before all of it hits the ground. The Kingston Plains in the eastern upper peninsula of Michigan is a great example of how deforestation and wildfire has caused local climate change. If you've listened to the episode, I covered the Kingston Plains in the first season of the podcast. The Kingston Plains region once contained a large amount of high-quality white pine. Logging occurred in the area from the 1880s to 1909 by lumber operators Thomas G. Sullivan, the Chicago Lumbering Company, the Manistee Lumber Company, and the Alger Smith Company. With the use of the railroad to move most of the lumber, very little was left. Like other logging regions, the cutover in the Kingston Plains was littered with the slash left by the lumbermen. Repeated burnings of the Kingston Plains occurred between the 1890s and the 1930s. Any vegetation that managed to take root after logging was doomed by these repeated fires. Not only was the vegetation destroyed, but the fires burned so hot because of all the available fuel, nutrients were baked out of the soil, leaving it sterile. Repeated attempts at reforestation has proved to be unsuccessful. Natural regeneration of the forest, lacking the pioneer species of aspen, birch, and cherry found elsewhere, has slowed to more than a century of slow growth. Still to this day, reindeer lichen is the most prominent vegetation found on the Kingston Plains. Conservation efforts. 1. Fire protection. In the wake of the severe fires in Michigan and the rest of the Great Lakes region, coupled with major fires in the West, including the 1910 Big Burn in Montana, Idaho, and Washington, The recently created National Forest Service under Gifford Pinchot and several states looked to the suppression of wildfires as the best way to protect the forest. Michigan had begun conservation efforts in the early 1900s, and in 1903, a forest fire law was enacted but not funded. It was nearly a decade later when fire protection began in earnest. In 1910, the Lake States Forest Fire Conference met in St. Paul, Minnesota, with representatives from Minnesota, Wisconsin, and Michigan fire control organizations. However, it was the Northern Forest Protective Association, a private sector organization made up of lumbermen in the Upper Peninsula in Wisconsin, that created the first policies to protect the standing timber from fire. This organization, under the leadership of Thomas B. Wyman, the forester for the Cleveland Cliffs Iron Company, hired 19 fire wardens to patrol the forests of the western Upper Peninsula. In 1914, the Northern Hardwood Manufacturers Association would follow in the Lower Peninsula in the protection of the forests. The first fire towers appeared at this time, both in the new state forest reserves at Higgins Lake and Houghton Lake. Although these were on the early state forests, the state of Michigan would not take over the responsibility of fire control until 1917. One area where the state did take the lead was to inspect locomotives and railroad right-of-ways for fire prevention in 1912. It had been known since at least 1873 that the railroad was a major contributing factor in the Great Fire of 1871. Governor Henry Baldwin had signed into law a bill to regulate railroads in the forest areas, but it was never acted upon, even after the successive fires over the next decades. Fire wardens would not only watch for smoke from the vantage point of the fire towers, but would regularly patrol the rail lines on velocipedes, a three-wheeled bicycle that could ride on the rails. Fire protection in Wisconsin got off of the ground in 1911 with the appointment of 11 special fire wardens whose job not only included watching for fires from fire towers, patrolling the railroads and forests, but also in the construction of fire breaks and roads to reach potential wildfires. In 1915, Wisconsin led the way in using an airplane for air patrol for fires. Other states would later follow. Michigan would not instigate air patrols on a regular basis until after World War II. 2. Reforestation. Along with fire control, replanting trees was necessary for the comeback of the forests of the Great Lakes. As early as the 1880s, it was recognized in some circles that Michigan's forests would not come back on their own, but would need to be actively reforested. We revisit Professor William Beal of the Michigan Agricultural College, who began experimental plantations in several locations throughout Michigan. His earliest planting was a 40-acre plantation located just east of the village of Grayling. I mentioned it in my reforestation episode last season, the Beal Plantation. On this plantation, he planted over 5,000 trees consisting of over 40 different species. Most of the non-native trees did not thrive. The three best performing trees were Norway spruce, red pine, and eastern white pine. A remnant of this plantation still exists as a 7-acre parcel surrounded by the Grayling Industrial Park. While logging was still ongoing, the reforestation movement was slow to take off. As the 20th century dawned, however, this soon began to change. President Theodore Roosevelt and Forester Gifford Pinchot would lead the charge on a national level with the creation of the United States Forest Service as part of the Department of Agriculture in 1905, with Pinchot as the agency's first director. This not only led to the protection of forests in the western United States from uncontrolled logging, but established new forests in the eastern United States that would be created through planting from nursery stock. This included national forests in Michigan, Minnesota, and Wisconsin. Michigan's reforestation effort on a statewide level coincided with the national events. The Michigan Forestry Commission hired Professor Philbert Roth as the first warden of forests. Under Roth's leadership, the Forestry Commission established the Higgins Lake State Forest Reserve and the Houghton Lake State Forest Reserve in 1903. Both forests were to be replanted from nursery stock supplied by the Higgins Lake State Forest Nursery that was begun in 1904 on the site of a former potato farm. Concurrently, Professor Roth also accepted a position with the University of Michigan to establish the first forestry program in Michigan. Although the University of Michigan's forestry program no longer exists, both Michigan State University and Michigan Technological University have leading forestry programs. There are also forestry programs in Minnesota and Wisconsin as well. Reforestation efforts in Michigan and elsewhere accelerated in the 1930s with the establishment of the Civilian Conservation Corps as part of the President Franklin Roosevelt's New Deal to combat the effects of the Great Depression. Just briefly here, I'll cover the CCC's work again. We've already had 2 episodes, but they were possibly the greatest federal work project that has ever existed. During the 11-year existence of the CCC from 1933 to 42, the men involved would do a variety of conservation work, including reforestation, soil conservation and erosion control, wildlife and fisheries work, forest fire control, and park development. Across the United States, the CCC would plant more than 700 million trees, mostly in the cutover lands resulting from the lumber industry. In Michigan alone, more than 484 million trees were planted, more than half of all planted by the CCC in the entire country. In the Great Lakes region, 12 national forests were either established or expanded under the work of the CCC. These included the Hiawatha, Huron, Manistee, Marquette, which is now a part of the Hiawatha National Forest, and Ottawa National Forest in Michigan, the Chippewa and Superior National Forests in Minnesota, and the Chequamegon and Nicolet National Forests in Wisconsin. While the CCC ended with the United States' entry into World War II, reforestation and conservation continued after the end of the war. Mostly led by state efforts through the state departments of natural resources or conservation, forest planting, erosion control, and waterway restoration has continued. Michigan has the largest acreage of state-owned forest lands in the United States at nearly 4 million acres. This is a larger area than the state of Connecticut. While the Higgins Lake Nursery closed in 1965, other state nurseries have continued to supply seedlings for reforestation in the state. Both Minnesota and Wisconsin have numerous state forests as well. The U.S. Forest Service continues to manage the national forests through the 3 states as well. Conclusions. While it was not widely understood at the time, the deforestation of the Great Lakes region through the largely uncontrolled logging of the pine and hardwood forests and the subsequent wildfires that followed led to localized climate change. Temperatures cooled, the air and soil dried, and greenhouse gases were emitted into the atmosphere. Few records were officially recorded at this time, but examples of the results remain in places like the Kingston Plains. The conservation movement that arose during this period helped to reverse many of the climate changes. The creation of the U.S. Forest Service and similar state agencies led to the creation of forest reserves that would allow for regulated logging on state and federal land instead of the unregulated cut and run of the lumber boom eras. These reserves would also be replanted to allow for a continuous reserve of timberlands. Modern forestry practices that were first taught at Yale University and the Biltmore Forestry School on George Vanderbilt's Biltmore Estate near Asheville, North Carolina, have continued at modern forestry schools at universities across the country, including Michigan State University, Michigan Tech, the University of Minnesota, and the University of Wisconsin. All of this has led to a rebirth of the Great Lakes forests that are not only a place of managed lumber operations, but also a mecca of outdoor recreation. The forests of the Great Lakes states have gone through a cycle of being a pristine wilderness with little impact from human occupation to the supplier of wealth and growth, then an environmental wasteland, to finally a place of clean air, water, and forests once again. So, as you heard here, as I read off of my paper, climate change, even in a locally centered area, did occur based on the lumber industry, and with the results of that, the slash, the wildfires, cooling temperatures, dried soils, all of that happened because of the unchecked logging that took place. Now, as if as a listener of this podcast, you can tell that I have my views on logging, but I'm not anti-logging by any means. I 25 or 15 years running the Hartwick Pines Logging Museum, I certainly saw the benefits of logging, what it did for the health of the economy of Michigan, how that brought in new immigration to the state, provided jobs, provided wealth, but there was also an environmental damage that was part of that. And, today was just looking at the climate of it. We will talk in future episodes coming up very soon about how it affected some of the wildlife. It'll be coming up with the passenger pigeon. That was not all based on logging. The disappearance of the passenger pigeon here in our northern forest, but that was a contributing factor along with the great commercial hunting that took place throughout the regions of the passenger pigeon. And we will look at all of this in various factors, throughout the podcast. The fur trade also affected the wildlife greatly, and that will also be talked about in future episodes. So just wanting to kind of open people's minds to, that lumber industry, although it was great for many people. It provided jobs, it built communities, but it also did have a very large negative impact on the forest and on the surrounding environment. So I want you to think about that today and kind of mull it over as you continue to listen to this podcast. And, I hope that this episode was thought-provoking for you and that you enjoyed it. And as always, I want you to tell a friend if you enjoyed this program. Tell somebody, spread the word. The podcast is growing, and that is all completely thanks to you as a listener. And now there is the opportunity to support the podcast. So if you go to my Buzzsprout website, North Country History with Rob Berg at .buzzsprout.com/supporters, you will be able to find, or forget the /supporters, just North Country History with Rob Berg .buzzsprout.com. You'll find the button for supporters on there, and you can click on that. And the full web address for the supporters page I will provide in the show notes as well. So you can help keep this going by chipping in a few dollars here and there to help support the infrastructure, the overhead of the podcast. So thank you again for listening today, and I really appreciate your support. And stay tuned for next week's episode. Will be on the passenger pigeon with special guest Kyle Bagnall from the Mackinac State Historic Parks. Thank you. Have a great day. Bye. North Country History with Rob Berg is hosted, written, and produced by Rob Berg. Music is Crack o' Dawn, performed by Reveille, licensed through Soundstripe. Follow North Country History with Rob Berg on YouTube and on Facebook at Rob Berg, Environmental Historian.